Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Flip the Script podcast, brought to you by FlipGen. I'm Paddy. I'm a digital rebel for FlipGen and a youth leader for the 4Os Coalition, and I'm hosting this podcast alongside Allegra and Connor, two other fellow youth leaders of the 4Os Coalition. And today we're really excited to be joined by Dr. Kaitlyn Regehr. We're so excited to talk to Kaitlyn about all things digital wellbeing, her research at UCL, and her book, Smartphone Nation. As always with Flip the Script, we'll cover three main topics with Kaitlyn before we flip the script and ask her for some input on FlipGen, specifically education, regulation, and collaboration.
For those listeners who are new to FlipGen, we are a youth-led digital wellbeing movement aimed at improving the next generation's relationship with technology and fostering healthier digital habits. We have 18 incredible digital rebels who are all aged between 14 and 25 years old, all from different backgrounds and all over the country who volunteered to lead FlipGen's work. The three pillars of FlipGen's work are campaigning, content, and community. We feel very passionately about educating and empowering the next generation.
Dr. Kaitlyn Regehr is an Associate Professor and the Programme Director of Digital Humanities in the Department of Information Studies. Kaitlyn's research work focuses on the impact of social media and how we can help younger generations manage healthy technological relationships and improve their digital well-being. Kaitlyn has explained how algorithms can amplify harm, and like FlipGen's For Us campaign, has advocated for stronger policy and greater digital education in school. Her work has informed legislation on cyberflashing, and she spoke at the Women and Equality's House of Commons Select Committee on the manosphere and online misogyny. Kaitlyn wrote the amazing Smartphone Nation, published back in May, and has just got back from Canada promoting it. We are absolutely thrilled to have her on the podcast today. Kaitlyn, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So, before we dive into the book, I want to ask you about your research, specifically the Digital Nutrition Project back in summer 2024, with Dr. Kaitlyn Shaughnessy and Dr. Catherine Smales. Tell us about the project and what key things you learned about young people's digital habits and their level of digital literacy.
Yeah, so I should say first that I have been informed by, many scholars and projects leading up to this point. You mentioned the digital flashing legislation, and that was a project led by Professor Jessica Ringrose, also at UCL, which looked specifically at young people's sexting and image-based abuse practices, so sharing of nude images. I then moved on to looking at the way in which algorithms can prioritize hate, harm, and disinformation because they are more attention-grabbing things. And I worked with Kaitlyn and Nikki Shaughnessy on that, in which we specifically took the case study of the manosphere and online misogyny and how that was being promoted on TikTok. And then more laterally, I began to work with Dr. Kaitlyn Shaughnessy and Dr. Catherine Smales on young people pushing back against these processes and how we kind of embed good, strong algorithmic literacy. And I'd like to distinguish that from digital literacy, algorithmic literacy. So what are these algorithms actually doing to think about quality of consumption? And the reason for that project was really because so much of the guidance that we have historically relied upon has been this idea of screen time. That is, we generally want to limit our dosage of screen consumption to about 1 to 2 hours a day. And not only is that guidance probably not realistic anymore, but it also came out of research on physical health and well-being. That is to say, if you are not moving around outside and you're spending all your time on screens, that's probably not a good thing for your physical health. But what that guidance doesn't do and never sought to do was to think about mental health well-being. Really, that guidance was about the quantity of consumption, but not the quality of consumption. And so this piece of work started to think about, can we give people more nuanced guidance about the quality of consumption and how they can take control over the quality of digital consumption that they're doing? And how can we help young people in particular distinguish between the good things we do online, like education, like healthy socialization, and the bad things that we do online, which are maybe putting us into a very passive stance, maybe things that uh, um, aren't activating good brain functionality, and on the kind of harder edge of it are actually causing us harm. And so we developed this food style pyramid, just like we have with food consumption, to help young people think about those things. And we met with young people from across the country. We had them feed into that guidance. We took their opinions on board, and we developed the digital nutrition plan with the Association of School and College Leaders on the back of that piece of work.
And we love the digital nutrition analogy. Just like good food is important for your body and understanding how to eat healthy food and to limit certain foods, digital nutrition is about choosing what you look at, what you read, what you watch online. It's about choosing your digital content. And like you were saying, previously people just thought all screen time is bad. But you explained it's not just how much screen time you have, but rather what content you consume. Tell us in more depth about the digital diet pyramid.
Sure. So I think in order to think about what our digital diet is, again, to go down this analogy a little, a little bit further, I actually and my team encourages young people to actually think about what they're currently consuming. So keeping a phone-fed journal, just like we might keep a food journal, so that you actually start to write down, what is the content that I'm consuming? How often am I consuming it? And how do I feel after that consumption? Do I feel better or worse after that period of digital usage? If the answer is I feel worse, you might want to decide to make some changes. So if you keep a phone-fed journal over the period of a week, and at the end of it, you think, well, I'm really not happy with what I'm consuming. And there's lots of times where I started a session to do one thing and I ended up doing something entirely different that I'm not happy with. And then I felt really bad at the end of that. It's worth thinking about making a change. And I think what's so important about this analogy is that we want to move away from this idea that we are just passive products that just consume whatever is put in front of us on our feeds, but rather move people into this idea that we can be active participants, that we can make active choices, that we can be much more intentional about our usage. Because in the offline space, you wouldn't just consume everything that was put in front of you. You would think that you had personal agency and you would make choices. And sure, like sometimes they wouldn't be the right choices. Sometimes we sit down and eat a whole tub of ice cream and we feel like garbage afterwards. But like you've made that choice and you are aware that you made that choice. And I think what is almost shocking about our digital consumption is we tend not to be aware that every time we open our phone, every time we flip on a screen, we actually are making choices. We're making choices to not think. We are making choices to just consume on autopilot. Those are choices. And that means if you want to, you can make different choices.
Brilliant. And if we think of digital nutrition about the content you consume, is there an argument for saying that the way you consume that content, the addictive nature of social media algorithms, is more like, say, drugs rather than just food?
So that analogy is often made, and we hear it that, the only other industry that uses the term user is the drug industry. I think that is really more down to the way in which we have economically structured social media. We're not really the consumers of technology. We are not the ones who pay for this technology. Advertisers are. And the whole economic structure is to hold us there as long as possible, to hold our attention as long as possible. That's the economic structure. And so if you become aware of that, if you become aware that you are actually the product, or rather your time and attention is the product, which is being sold to advertisers, you can actually start to become more critical of your usage. You can start to push back against that and start to become more intentional. And when I talk about algorithmic literacy versus digital literacy being this idea that we should teach young people in schools how to use tech, how to use a computer, how to use an iPad. I think we're all doing a pretty good job of that. Like, we know how to use an iPad. What we should be really thinking about is, how do these technological processes work and what are they doing to us? And with that information in mind, how do we become much more critical about these processes so that we can take greater control? And that's, before, and I'm sure we'll get into legislation and the need to advocate for more regulation of these spaces. But I also really, really want people to know, and I think young people are better at this than older generations, in fact, that they do have personal agency, they do have power, and they can take control.
So, if you're trying to be the chef of your own digital diet, what practical steps can young people take to improve their digital well-being? Screen time limits, no phone zones, gaming your algorithm? Tell us your top 3 tips and why they work well for young people.
Yeah, so I think that carving out spaces in your life and in your home that you are not going to have devices is really important. I'm a big fan of no screens in the bedroom. I tend to say sunlight on your eyes before screen light in the morning. That is ideal. And that's going to, one of the most striking, I think, arguments, and one of the kind of most striking, if we think about research, and the research that is really clear here, is that having a phone in your bedroom impacts your sleep. And we should care about that. I mean, we need sleep. It's as boring as it is to talk about, we do need sleep. So I think carving out those spaces is really important. I think deciding when you want your phone to be less addictive is really good. So you can grayscale your phone. You can decide that when you walk in your front door, you're going to turn grayscale on because you just don't want that device to be so attention grabbing. That's a great thing to do. And finally, do a digital spring clean. If something isn't empowering you, unfollow it. If you already bought that bathing suit for summer holidays, you don't need to keep following that brand, which will probably only make you feel like you bought the wrong swimsuit in the first place. Like, unfollow, be brutal. Like, do that digital spring clean. It feels amazing. Just like, get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it. If it doesn't serve you, if it doesn't empower you, get rid.
So, in your book, you talk a lot about the importance of peer-to-peer learning programs as an excellent way for building community, youth voice, and leadership skills. In the book, you're referring up to the Violence Protection Programme in Scotland. Why do you think it would be a good fit for digital well-being, particularly given how difficult it is to stay up to date with this topic?
So the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program, which is part of Education Scotland and has been rolled out across half the schools in Scotland, is an amazing program. It uses a peer-to-peer mentoring model where older students mentor younger students, specifically around issues of misogyny and gender violence. And I worked with them on issues of incel and online misogyny and helped them develop some of their programming. So those are the materials that the mentors then use to deliver their sessions. I think this is an incredibly powerful program. One, in that it empowers youth voice. It gives leadership opportunities for young people. In some of the schools, they have hoodies that say, I'm a mentor. And it's really effective. Like, parachuting someone like me in to give one assembly one time just doesn't work. Like it does not work. They don't want to hear from me, and they shouldn't hear from me. What works is if you actually try and change the ecosystem of a school. So those mentors that you have equipped with digital literacy education or algorithmic literacy or AI literacy education do not, you know, their job doesn't end after that session. They exist within the ecosystem. They are in the schoolyard. They are in the lunchroom. They are in the corridors of that school, and they are modeling this type of good behavior. They are modeling this critical awareness. And that means the next month, when a new trend crops up, the next month, when there's a new hashtag that we need to be concerned about, they are actually on the ground and they can use their skill set to address that, and they can bring that issue within the sessions. I can't say too much, but I am in talks at the moment about rolling something similar out across England and Wales. And I really hope that it happens, because I actually think it's a no-brainer. I think it's good for everyone who's involved. And I think it's really easy to tell young people all the things they can't be without giving them role models and options about what they can. We're really good at telling people what they can't be, and we're not so good at providing opportunities for what they can. So I think if we do want to see a change, if we do want to see what I would like to think of as a profound cultural change around the issues brought forward by our digital age, we should be investing in many more peer-to-peer learning programs. I think they're fantastic.
Absolutely. I think there's some great examples of this happening already. UCL already run the Digital Speech Lab aimed at those aged 16 to 18. And the Flipp Gen Digital Rebels have developed a toolkit aimed at Gen A, which is 10 to 14-year-olds, to support and improve their digital well-being. The aim is to turn these into these workshops for schools to be run by Gen Z mentors. But why do you think there continues to be such gaps in the national curriculum when it comes to digital literacy?
So I think that, unfortunately, when we think about the standardized national curriculum and the approach to curriculums, um, alongside the technical space, that we are operating at two very, very different paces. Like, Mark Zuckerberg has famously said, about fast tech, move fast and break things. The national education curriculum has tried to do the opposite to that. It's to think carefully, to really, mull things over, and to not break things, and to be very cautious. And so these kind of two parallel realities that are happening on very different timelines are kind of quite antithetical to each other. And unfortunately, young people are falling down that divide. These are two big pillars on different timelines, and young people are falling down that gap. And that's a huge issue. I also think that we need to be pretty frank about the fact that we are dealing with a digitally illiterate population of adults for the most part. I mean, most adults did not grow up with these technologies. They themselves did not have these forms of education. And now we are expecting them to create curriculums around something they don't really understand. And I would say that the same goes for policy. We could have almost the same conversation about policy, and that is an issue. And that's why I think the programs that you mentioned, Connor, and these peer-to-peer mentoring approaches are so vital in this space, because we really do need to be hearing from youth voices and champion youth voices around their experiences around the digital landscape, in order to not only keep up to date, but also often inform older generations about the support that they need.
Absolutely. And we keep referring to this term of digital literacy. I guess that has the potential to become incredibly broad beyond how to just use technology effectively. The term digital literacy now refers to things such as digital media literacy, which is being aware of the addictive nature of algorithms, how to spot fake news and recognize bias, as well as this thing of digital citizenship, which is how to behave responsibly online. Why do you think these topics are particularly important, given the recent news that 16-year-olds will be able to have the next vote?
Yeah. So I mean, so what you're referring to there is the kind of impact that the digital space can have on our beliefs and on our politics. And I think you're right to bring that up. I think that we need to acknowledge that if we are going to inhabit digital spaces, that that is a risk that we will confront mis and disinformation, that we will be susceptible to bias, that we will exist in what Eli Perezer refers to as a U loop, and that those U loops can become echo chambers. And we need to be aware that these are the structures that we will be confronted with if we are going to operate in the digital space. And so, yes, we need digital education to lay that out and to explain how the attention economy functions and to explain how content often will become more and more extreme in order to hold our attention longer and longer and longer. And I think equally, we need to give young people tools to actually have conversations offline with other generations, with other people in their lives about the impacts of the digital space, because it's not just young people who are susceptible to echo chambers, it is older people too. And these kind of polarized realities that we have now in our society are playing out in households and across Christmas dinner tables, across this country. And so, how do we also equip young people to have the discussion with Uncle such and such who has found himself in his own echo chamber? And how, at the same time, do we help young people realize that they themselves are in their own echo chamber? And that has led to everyone be around that whole table, probably being in their own very specific silos. We're all in silos. Every single one of us are in a silo. And so kind of how do we deal with that? I mean, one thing that I would say is that instead of gearing up, I have a thumbs up that's just come up on my screen. Thank you, Riverside Podcast Suite, for giving me the thumbs up. So one thing that I would say is that instead of debating Uncle such and such on the specifics of the echo chamber he is in, try and take a step back as a family, as a community, and look at the technological processes at play, which are forcing us all down narrower and narrower pathways. And so step back from the minutia of the issue, step away and actually start to look at the processes that are pushing us apart from each other. And I think it's really important that we do this because we don't sit down and watch television together as a family nearly as much anymore. I mean, I was just at the BBC's Teen Summit in Bradford last week, and as part of it, they had a group of young people take their devices out of their bedrooms for a week. And one young person said, I sat down and watched the television with my parents. Can you believe it? And to which other teenagers were kind of aghast. Like that was such a kind of old-fashioned thing to do. But that is a very different viewing experience where you are watching the same thing together, probably having discussions or interactions about that content, than sitting alone in your room consuming an algorithmically driven feed. That's a very different experience. Qualitatively, it's not a collective experience, and it doesn't really, for the most part, improve socialization. And so I think we need to be, you know, aware of the usage of others around us and how to talk about that usage, but also be aware of our own usage and think about how it's very different than the type of media consumption we would have done 2 decades ago.
Absolutely. And you recently did a little video for BBC Bite Size.
Yeah.
How do we raise awareness generally about the need for digital literacy and move away from simply focusing on the negatives around social media, like a lot of people do? And this often runs the risk of alienating young people if they don't feel heard. So, yeah, how do we raise awareness?
So, I mean, I think conversations like this are fantastic. I think, I do think that the work of BBC Bite Size is great. I love working with them. And that was on the back of the Teen Summit that I mentioned, which was really important. And there was a lot of, I think, perspectives that were highlighted at that Teen Summit that often don't get highlighted. I mean, young people were talking about the fact that they themselves were consuming conspiracy theories and that they were no longer sure what truth was or what they could trust in. And they were essentially outlining what the Rand Institute refers to as truth decay, where you no longer think anything is true. And I think that that is profoundly worrying. If you have young people who actually think maybe there is no truth, that is, I think that is a terrifying idea, because there is truth and there are facts and some things just are true. They have to be, or else, we have nothing really. And so I think that it's so vital that we engage in these really robust discussions about what young people are facing, spaces that feel safe so that they can actually voice things like that they're not sure whether the moon landing was staged, you know, that they feel like that they have also hope for the future, because that is another thing that came out, is that young people were saying, well, we think AI is going to take all our jobs, and so we're just not going to try anymore. And that is a very I think that is an incredibly disheartening thing to hear. And I think that it is true that we do need to worry about these technologies. We need to be advocating for, AI safety, for digital safety, for greater policy. We need to be pushing for it. But at the same time, it's so vital that we don't lose hope. Like, there is hope here. Conversations like this today bring us hope, and we can believe that change is possible.
Thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating so far. And I just want to kind of focus a bit more on regulation and the legislation side. And you've talked a lot so far today about kind of education, but in the past, you've also kind of focused on regulation. And the first kind of question is it a case that these two things, regulation and education, have to work together, or is one more important than the other, do you think, in the current climate?
So I always talk about two pillars around this issue. In fact, three pillars, really, which is moderation, regulation, and education. When I talk about moderation, that is the kind of mitigation of use, or the limiting of use. And that is something I think we all need to do. I think we all need to mitigate our dependence on digital devices. And we need to, you know, ban some forms of our usage. Like, some forms of usage are just not good for us. I'm just come from Women's Hour, and we were talking about phubbing in this process where people snub each other because we're on our phones so much and we're so addicted to these devices and so reactive to notifications that we are not present in the offline world. And that is leading to huge issues within relationships. And that is leading to, for teenagers, there's evidence to suggest that it's really bad for their self-esteem if their parents are on their phones all the time in front of them. And so we do need to crack down on those types of usage. We need to find phone-free spaces in our lives. That's like really, really important. We've talked about the education, which is this second pillar, which is the need to um, educate both young people and the general population about the way that these technological processes work and the way in which they can take greater control over them. That's really important, and that we empower people to take greater agency and greater intentionality over their usage. Yes. The final thing is regulation, as you rightly suggest, Patty, and that is this kind of big thing, which is pushing government to lay down what I would argue needs to be very robust, hard-hitting, bold types of policies and legislation. I fed into parts of the Online Safety Act. I don't think it's very good. I think it's gone, it's quite light touch. And part of that is because so much of our regulation is really about a cleanup job afterwards. It is reactive rather than proactive. It is about, cleaning up harm after someone has slipped and fallen, essentially. And that's problematic. And so we want to push back against that. Of course, the debate that we always run into is the free speech debate. And that is this idea that the thing that made the internet so beautiful, the thing that made social media so beautiful, was that it enabled free speech. It's easy to forget that 20 years ago, if you wanted to say something publicly, your platforms to do so, were very, very limited. You could write a letter to the editor of a newspaper and hope they published it. You could try and call into a radio show and hope they put you on. But ultimately, your platform to speak from has been limited. And, it's easy for us to talk about the harms of social media and forget that, these platforms gave way to amazing things like citizen journalism and digital activism, and regular people were given platforms to speak from like never before. That is important. However, with those platforms and with this kind of greater accessibility, we all became in many ways much more vulnerable and much more accessible than ever before. And as the technology has become more advanced, this kind of digital town square, as proposed by Elon Musk, is less and less true, because this digital town square assumes that everyone has an equal voice in the square, has an equal platform in the square. And that's just not the case. And in fact, it's less and less so the case as we drive ourselves further and further into what Cernick refers to as the algorithmic economy. And so when we talk about legislation around these issues, and we kind of hear the debates against it, which is about free speech, I tend to say this, and in fact, I said this at the select committee, at the Women's Inequality Select Committee a few months ago, which is, I am not so interested in the debates around right to publication. I think people should have the right to publish. I do think someone should have the right to publish their suicide journey if that is what they want to do. This is not a debate about the right to publication. This is a debate about the right to dissemination. That is to say, it is not about whether someone has the right to publish their suicide journey, but whether Meta has the right to algorithmically offer that suicide journey to a 14-year-old. Whether they should be feeding that content to a 14-year-old. And that it is that distinction that is very important that we make. It is not about the right of publication. It is about the right of dissemination, because most people are consuming their content through an algorithmic feed that is suggested and recommended to them. That is how most people consume their content. And so the ethics around how that content is selected, how that content is proposed, is paramount. And that is what we need to focus on.
Yeah, I think that's such an important kind of point. And going back to what you said earlier about an issue of like the Online Safety Act, that it's kind of a cleanup job rather than getting ahead. I think I agree, and I know FlipGen with and for us with the manifesto we're trying to build is all about getting ahead. For example, in those algorithmic features for under 16s and addictive features. So I wholeheartedly agree there. And kind of just on the point you're talking earlier about nutrition and digital nutrition and the ability for people and young people to see themselves as kind of active and not just passive consumers. A policy that's been put forward by the Liberal Democrats recently is having a health warning on tech platforms and social media platforms, like for cigarettes, say, and maybe like calorie on and sugar tax on food. Do you think that's something that could kind of straddle the divide and blur the lines between the regulation and the education we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need similar to, you brought up cigarettes, and similar to the anti-smoking campaigns of decades ago, there were multiple prongs to this. There were, there were public health warnings, there was education, there was, as you point out, there was kind of labels that were put on things and still are. And I do think we need all of those things. I think the idea of labeling is a good one. Um, and I think it is important in order to inform users, as we call them, um, about the addictive qualities and about the attention grabbing qualities and the potential harms of the attention economy. I also think that we need to move away from this idea that of tech companies, digital librarians that file and categorize content but do not have responsibility for that content, and start to think of them more as a publisher and as a broadcaster that have to abide by certain codes of conduct and have a responsibility over the content. And I think we've allowed them to get away with being categorized as a tech company and not as a publisher or as a broadcaster for far too long. And if we were to start to think of them slightly differently, we could start to engage with ideas around labeling content in certain ways, around categorizing content, having rating systems for content, because they would hold greater responsibility over such content. And I think that's really worth thinking about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kind of coming back to something you mentioned earlier about an issue of education is that, a lot of adults and older people are less tech literate and digital literate than younger people. You link that to regulation. Think that some of these some of this legislation would be better if it involved more young people. And how can we do that in the future? How can we involve more young people in the implementation of regulation on tech?
Well, I think it's we need to kind of um, clarify what we mean by young people, and clarify what we mean by expertise. I mean, part of the issue is that we don't have a lot of this expertise that stays, within governance, uh, partially because the price tag is just so great in Silicon Valley and it's really hard to compete. And so you end up at the moment, you have kind of advisors, generally from academia, kind of like me, who are running kind of back and forth and trying to um, share information. I think that yes, we do need to hear from young people. We need, to hear about the experiences of young people and what this kind of means on the ground. Absolutely. And we also need greater expertise within governance about how these processes actually work so that they can govern appropriately around them. And that is something that, yes, young people can talk about from their experiences, but also probably young people who are working within tech who have that expertise. The more that we could see them moving over into governance, taking up policy positions, and hopefully that will happen as this generation, as Gen X, moves further into the work space and are able to take on these positions of influence.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the dream world is somebody who's got that experience, but also that expertise in the tech industry. And hopefully, with the kind of now we're getting a generation of people who are working who have that experience of growing up with tech.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll see that more and more. And just kind of a final question from me. In your book, you talked about the kind of tragic case of Molly Russell and the kind of really sad irony that um, her father wasn't able to show what she found or saw on social media when he went on TV to speak about it. Do you think that is kind of talks to a broader problem with tech and social media more than just that one case? I think we're seeing more and more kind of young people, like tragic case of young people losing their lives. Do you think that speaks to a bigger problem with big tech now?
So what you are referring to is when Ian Russell, the father of Molly Russell, who tragically took her life at the age of 14 after consuming huge amounts of self-harm on on Meta, on Instagram, essentially. When being interviewed on television, he actually took some of the images, some of the content that she had consumed by way of her feed on Meta in an envelope onto television and said, "This is so bad that I cannot show it on television." You know, it is not acceptable to be broadcast on television, and yet it was fed to my 14-year-old by way of her feed. And what that story really indicates is exactly what we were talking about before, that the things that we see in the digital space, may be permitted in the digital space, and they can be not permitted in the kind of television broadcast space, or because they do not fit within what Ofcom deems to be acceptable for public consumption. And that, I think, is deeply problematic, where you can have content which is, and in fact, he was on, a daytime television show that was really for adults, that it's not acceptable for adults to view, except it's being algorithmically offered to a 14-year-old girl. And that is who is suffering from anxiety and depression. And that is so, it is I think so inherently, problematic, and it's so kind of deeply concerning, and it's something that I think should all feel angry about, but also feel that we want to push back against, because ultimately policy follows the public will. And if enough of us are angry, if enough of us say, that's just not right, then, then we can see a change.
Absolutely. So we're now going to flip the script and ask you for your quick fire advice about FlipGen. So I'll start with the first question, which is, if you're a Gen Z digital rebel, what one key piece of information would you be wanting to educate Gen A about?
I think it's that you do not have to be a passive product. You can be an active participant. Can take you can take control over these processes.
Yeah, I think that's so important and a different perspective that we've not really heard before. So my question is, if you were a digital rebel, what one piece of regulation that isn't currently in here at the moment, what would you be campaigning for?
I would like to see that there is a rating system on content and that there is some content that should not be algorithmically offered to young people.
Awesome. Completely agree. And aside from this fabulous podcast episode, what do you think a future Dr. Kaitlyn Regehr and FlipGen collaboration could look like?
Wow. Well, I mean, my new piece of research is actually on young people's use of AI and how they're using AI and what they are not developing in themselves because they're over dependent on AI. And perhaps we can work together on that piece of research in some way.
Sounds brilliant.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kaitlyn. Some great takeaways we took were the importance of refining your digital nutrition and digital diet, the importance of peer-to-peer programs and mentors in schools to help even more young people, and also how we need bold, robust regulation and policy because, as you said, current legislation is reactive rather than proactive, which is something that I think is absolutely essential that we tackle. And like Kaitlyn, FlipGen believes in no tech with a K rather than no tech. And the key is to educate yourself and educate the next generation. And we think it's essential to listen to the youth voices out there who are discussing these topics. Check out both flipgen.com and www.forus.org.uk. And Kaitlyn, it has been wonderful to talk to you today. Huge thank you for all your hard work advocating for young people, and a huge thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.